Well, good morning. Last week we finished the questions on lesson 2 and got into lesson 3. And what we had studied so far in lesson 3 included the themes that are found in this book. We had talked about how it's necessary to understand what these themes are to understand the book. And the first one was the relationship between God, the church, and the state. And God was showing through these visions given to John that he's in control, that he's the one controlling things in the world, who the rulers are and what's happening. And he's also showing that he uses them to accomplish his ends in human history. We discussed that this wasn't the first time that this idea had come up. It was specifically brought up in the book of Daniel and the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, how for several years he basically acted like a cow, eating out in the pasture, and it wasn't until he had come to the realization that God was in control that God restored him to his position. John is saying the same thing here. God's in control. Don't worry about it. God knows what he's doing. The second theme that we talked about was the idea of martyrdom and persecution, specifically that it's going to continue for a while. They were going to continue to be persecuted. They were going to be more martyrs. And even though the saints didn't understand it, it was in God's plan. And God's plan was going to be carried out. The third theme was that of warfare and victory. The forces of evil are going to make war with God's saints, and although they're going to be hurt, they're going to eventually be victorious. So, any comments or questions on what we studied last week before we move on? It's important to understand that these are the themes talked about in the book. And it did have relevance to the Christians of the time. Okay?
I think it helps to understand that this message is given over and over again in different ways.
Yes.
And if we understand that goes a long way in helping understand the kind of literature it is.
Yes.
And if we tried to interpret this literally, it would be such a monstrosity. It wouldn't be edifying at all.
It would not. If you try to interpret literally, then you see obvious contradictions in itself, and then also in the world that we have today. There are things that it talks about that we believe don't exist. So, no one sees a dragon. No one knows a bottomless pit. How do you know it's bottomless? They just may not have hit yet. So, moving on, we need to talk about the approaches to the interpretation of Revelation. And we touched on this briefly, but we're going to kind of pick up here. And I believe I mentioned that whenever I first tried to study this, you'd look at different references and they would all be confusing because they would contradict each other. You'd get one reference and it would say this means this. You'd go to another one and said, no, it means this. And basically, you throw up your hands and say, well, nobody can understand that. And that's what's been happening for a while. That was one of the reasons we talked about in our very first lesson why people tend to avoid this book. It's because of the confusion. It's not surprising whenever people do start studying it that they start falling into 4 or 5 different camps. You know, some of them will say, well, I like this idea, let's study it this way. Others will go another way. And over time, it's kind of sorted itself out into about 5 approaches. And Miss Pat, when she was here last week, talked about those, brought those up. The first one that we're going to talk about is what's called the futuristic approach. And this is the idea of premillennialism. And whenever you study premillennialism, you'll see graphs like this, or pictures. And they're very complicated. You know, they'll talk about the church age, the tribulation, the millennium, Satan being loosed again, and then finally, we all going to heaven. That's complicated. They've got a good theory worked out. They don't all agree with it themselves about what order. There are many different conflicting pathways, I guess you would call it. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about the futuristic approach. And people like Billy Graham, he was a big proponent of it. Jerry Falwell, Jim Baker, and then Tim LaHaye, who wrote the Left Behind books. These are the type of people that fall into that camp. And basically they think that the whole book of Revelation has to do with what they call the end times. Now, conveniently, we're always living in the end times for them so that they can, I hate to say it, but keep it stirred up, keep conflict going, keep the money coming in. But that's what they always think. And then anytime that there is a disaster or a conflict, they'll point to Revelation and say, this is being fulfilled, this is the end times, this is what it was talking about. So they look at the book of Revelation as a bunch of prophecies that didn't have anything to do with the first century, but what was going to be happening to the end of time. The events in chapters 4 through 19, interestingly, you know, they're all going to be fulfilled in the period of time known as the tribulation. And if you look on the picture on the right, the tribulation is that section between the 2 red arrows. You know, you have Christ coming, you have the Christian age, and then basically there's the rapture, the tribulation starts, and then Christ comes again. And so they're talking about what's happening between that 7-year time, that 7-year period of time. And they're saying everything in Revelation in these chapters, basically, you know, 4 through 9, chapters 4 through 9, 4 through 19, excuse me. They'll say that that's going to all happen in that 7-year period. And so they're very interested in what's going to go on then. And one of the major beliefs is that a Antichrist is going to appear on the stage of history. What do we know about the Antichrist?
Already have.
Excuse me?
They already have.
There have already been Antichrist. There is not a single Antichrist.
There's always been an Antichrist. People go against Christ.
Yes. And John specifically said anyone who denies that Jesus came in the flesh was an Antichrist. So it's not like it's some unknown figure. It could be a lot of different people. And yet this theory says, no, there's going to be one. Now, depending on who is the big bad political person, you know, in some foreign land, it could be Mao Zedong for a while, or it could be, what's his name, Kim Jong-il, or John Jin-yoon, or I don't remember what his name is. But anyway, it becomes whatever political person is the worst. Excuse me?
I said that could be about any.
It could be any of them. And it's,
I want to ask a question. How do they, the people that believe this, where do they get a reference to Christ coming back the second time after he ascends?
I don't know, because it is not in the Bible.
I wondered that because it says he'll come back, but it doesn't say anything about the second coming of him as far as after the ascension.
Right. And we know that there are indications that this is not going to be a drawn-out thing. It says, you know, then comes the end. And so it's not going to be stretched out over 1,007 years. Okay.
One person looks at it as maybe the Pope, you know, the
Mhm.
Roman one. And, he's still right, he's already been there 1,250 years or more, so that rules that out. So it can't be him.
You would think not. And one thing that you'll find as you're going through this lesson is some of these ideas become overlapped. And people who haven't really studied it a lot will pick things from one camp and some things from another camp, and it all gets mashed together. Yes, Dick?
A lot of this, one of the early figures that revived all this was Hal Lindsey
Yes.
in his late Great Planet Earth, that book, and that book was made into a movie. We went to see it back in the 70s, and there's been a lot of pictures that have been sold of people flying up in the air and cars running off the road, and all the bumper stickers, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned, and all of that, and that made a lot of money.
Yes.
And then later on, he criticized some of these guys for doing the same thing he did.
Yeah. Okay. They also say that whenever Jesus comes back again, the judgment's not going to take place all at once. We alluded to that. You know, they say there's going to be the tribulation. Jesus is going to come, and then for 1,000 years, he's going to reign on the earth from Jerusalem. And this is a picture that kind of points out where that is, just to the right of the red arrow. That purple block is labeled millennium, and that's the time that Jesus is supposed to be reigning for 1,000 years. Then there's going to be a final judgment, and we're all going to heaven. So, the futurists, well, they claim to be literalists. They believe that it's actually going to be 1,000 years. But what do we know about interpreting things? You have to treat it all the same. So if they interpret that as a literal 1,000 years, then by necessity they have to interpret everything else in the book of Revelation as literal. However, when they do that, they're ignoring other scripture. And then they have to twist and strain and make it fit.
The main thing that people forget is time in God's side is not time like our time. He doesn't see time like we do. He's not, one day might be to him 1,000 or 6,000, you know what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it. However, God is consistent as well.
He's consistent in his time, and we don't know his time. But we measure time by years basis, but he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's also important to know that God gave us that measurement.
Yes. You know, in first chapter of Genesis, he didn't say in the first millennium I created light. He said the first day.
He didn't tell us how long it was.
And he told us how long it was. And so, even though God's interpretation of time is not the same, he did tell us what it meant. So, whenever you're talking about the futurist approach, you have to ask yourself, well, what did these 7 churches get out of that?
Not nothing.
It wouldn't be relevant to them, would it? If this was going to be happening in the future, a long time in the future, it wouldn't mean anything to them. And so that is a problem with this approach. So that's the futuristic. Like I said, it's where we get premillennialism. Any comments or questions on that? Yes, Dave.
Well, and especially those that think it's all about Jerusalem. This lesson makes it clear that from chapter 17, verse 18, and the woman whom thou sawest is the great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. That
Yeah.
wasn't Jerusalem.
No.
That was Rome.
The second approach is called the historist or the historicist. I have trouble pronouncing some of these words. Whenever you see this one, this is the graph or the picture of what it comes. And these are the people that will say, you know, this is the history of the church throughout time up to now. And they're the ones that will go back and say, well, it was the Catholic Church coming into existence and the Pope, and then they'll look at all the things that have happened and they'll fit it in.
Reign of the Babylonian Empire, the Medes and Persians, that all comes into it.
Yes. And so they'll see it that way. They see the book of Revelation as a forecast, you know, for the entire time. And to do that, they take an event in history and they go back and say, well, that must be this. This is when it's talking about the dragon, or this is the Antichrist, or this is whoever. And so they're basically taking facts and trying to fit it into what the book of Revelation says. That allows them to, you know, they pay particular attention to the times, the times, and the halftime. And, you know, that's supposed to be 3.5 years, or so many centuries are supposed to have happened. And of course, these are pictures, you know, someone guy saying at the end of the world, but you have to remember there have been lots of people that have predicted the end of the world. And has anyone been right yet?
Never will be. Man never will be right.
Okay.
Only God knows.
And what did God say about a prophet who doesn't prophesy real things?
Not a prophet.
He says, don't believe him. You watch and see if what he says comes true, then you can believe he's from God. But if it doesn't, then you don't pay attention to him. Well, there have been a lot of people that have predicted the end of time. Obviously, they were wrong. We need to ignore what they said about other things as well. So, and again, when you have this point of view, it makes the letters to the churches irrelevant. It doesn't have any application for them.
If it's historic, how did they get around in these days, or in, you know, where it's talking about in the first few chapters, talking about it's written to people that would understand it?
Then they'll come back and say that this was all symbolic and you can't understand it. Basically. You know, that's an easy answer. Well, you just aren't smart enough to understand it. And we've been studying it for a long time and that type of thing. A lot of the older commentaries, whenever you look at those, they take this approach. And so that makes them kind of useless to use. And these are some of the prominent scholars, and these are names that, you know, you'll recognize, maybe not all of them, but some of them. You know, certainly John Wycliffe and Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Wesley, C.H. Spurgeon was particularly well known, Matthew Henry. And so they took that view of this being the historicist. You know, I'm not taking anything away from these gentlemen. They were obviously good scholars, but they missed it whenever they came to the book of Revelation, I think.
If we try hard enough, we can twist the Bible around to mean exactly what we want it to.
Yes.
I mean, there's been a lot of perversions, and we all know that.
Mm-hmm. And that is a problem that we often run into. People have a tendency to make up their mind what they believe and then want to run to the Bible to prove it. People that have been in my class before are probably getting tired of hearing this. But that's not the way that we're supposed to study the Bible. We're supposed to study the Bible and find out what it says and then believe it, not the other way around. The third approach is the philosophy of history. And basically they're idealists is what they call themselves. And they look at the whole book as being rather a large allegory. And according to this view, Revelation doesn't have any relevance to what's going on in the world. It's just about the struggle between God and Satan. And so you can't look at it and say, well, that means this, or, you know, the fall of this empire doesn't fit into anything. And so they say, you know, just take it for what it says and apply it to your life. And basically, you know, they acknowledge that saints are persecuted and martyred, and they say that's going to happen throughout history. Well, it has. No one questions that. Saints are persecuted. And they say that in the end, God's going to be victorious, and that also is true. And they're saying the book of Revelation is just a story that says that again. They say that the battles are spiritual, don't have anything to do with our, you know, with what we would call the real world. And again, this approach would have little use to the Christians at the time. It would contradict the first verse of Revelation that says that these events were shortly going to come to pass. You know, whenever he says that, you know, he's not saying, well, this is something that's been going on forever and going to keep going on. He said this is going to happen. So it's important to keep that in mind. And so they're trying to fit the book of Revelation into whatever political or cultural things are going on at the time. Whenever you do this, of course, it can mean anything. And it can be twisted to fit this. You can prove whatever you want to with the book of Revelation this way. The author makes the point, the author of this book, that unless interpretations are grounded in grammatical, historical, and contextual background, then they leave themselves wide open to alternative interpretations that can contradict even itself. And so it's unsatisfying to try to study the book of Revelation this way. Any comments or questions on the three that we've covered so far? to me, the middle two were kind of vague, hard to get a grasp on. That first one I can understand because it's prevalent around, you know, in today's society. We've heard it a lot. Probably the second one, more people 100 years ago would have been familiar with that. The third one, like I said, it's just kind of out there. The fourth one that we're going to talk about is called the preterist or contemporary historical approach. And basically, this is the 80-70 doctrine. Has everyone heard about the 80-70 doctrine?
Heard of it, but I need a refresher.
Okay. That's what we'll do. The preterist view, preter means past. And so in this camp, you have the people that says the book of Revelation is all in the past, and then you have a group that says, well, most of it's in the past, but a little bit of it's still to come. Full preterist said that all of the prophecies found in Revelation were fulfilled in AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. And they say that we're now living in heaven and earth, or the new heaven and the new earth. That's what we're living in now, and this is it. Nothing else is going to happen. In this next slide, if you can see the guy on the right, he's saying, relax, it's already happened. You know, instead of saying the end of the world's coming, he's saying, don't worry about it. It's already happened. The partial preterists believe that most of the book of Revelation was fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem, but the last 2 or 3 chapters talk about what's going to happen at the end of the world. And that's when Christ is going to come back. Crucial is the idea of when the book of Revelation was written. Because why would you expect a book written in 95 to talk about something that's already happened 20 years ago? Whenever you look at their view, one of the big problems is that the victory described at the end of Revelation never happened. If they say everything has happened, yes, Kathy.
Go ahead, I think,
No, that's fine.
I was just gonna say, a lot of members, not a lot, but some members of the church take this position. Matt King, who's written on this topic, takes that position, who's a member of the church. There's a good writing online by James Brown, who used to preach at Paragould, who now preaches outside of Memphis, that refutes Max King's writing on this, if anybody, and he breaks it down very easy for most people to understand, if anybody wanted to look that up. It's interesting reading.
Okay.
Thought I'd share that. Just found it the other day myself, so it's interesting.
Another name that you may recognize as a Christian who followed this view was Foy Wallace. He was good at a lot of things, but he believed the 80-70 doctrine, which has a lot of problems with it. So, Jordan, did that answer your question about what it was?
So basically, they believe it's already happened,
Pretty much.
which doesn't make sense because Revelation talks about things to come.
Well, it talked about things to come in 80-70 when it was written, they think, or before 87, but now it's happened.
Yeah, that Christ came back.
They say he came back. That was the end of the world.
I don't think that's the position Wallace took, though, that Christ came back. I know there is 80-70 theory, and that's wrong, but he was just taking the position that it was destruction. Destruction was in Jerusalem rather than, in Jerusalem, and it happened prior to, he takes an earlier view. That, a lot of those people think that the Revelation was the first book rather than the last book. Some of them do, of the New Testament. I think it was written approach.
Okay. I didn't study it a whole lot, so I don't know. I didn't get into things that I wasn't going to be teaching, so. We know the dates of some of the other books fairly definitely. Yes, Sandra?
So when do we get to go to heaven?
Well, if you believe the 80-70 version, this is it.
I think they do believe in a future judgment day, but
But there's,
it's kind of confusing in a
Well,
lot of ways, but
you know,
it's not literally heaven on earth here. They do believe there's a judgment, but it's very far reaching, very.
they think that the end times have already happened. And the way that they interpret that is by saying that the 80-70 was sort of the end of the age. It was the end of the world as the Jews knew it.
I think there may be a division in that just a little bit about how the end of the time is going to be. Some take one view and others take another view.
And then that's the full and the partial difference
Yeah.
between them. Yes,
Yeah,
Dick?
you mentioned that.
I think what David's referring to about for a while, I don't think he took the same position Max King did, but he did take the early date. And those who take the early date apply nearly everything to the Roman Catholic Church instead of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
And our understanding is it's the Roman Empire rules over the kings of the earth, not the Catholic Church.
Mhm. Well, at least not until the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And it's not as far away from us as you think it might be as far as people that believe it.
Mhm.
There are people very locally.
Oh, it's 20 minutes from here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. The question I would have with that interpretation is, why are you telling Christians in Asia Minor about something that's going to happen in Jerusalem? What relevance does it have to them? To me, that's the biggest flaw that I see. Yes.
Another thing we have to remember too is God gave us this book for us too. And if that's all behind us, then what hope is it for us? And why do we need to have the book? And it's all happened and done apply to us.
Yes,
Anything.
I agree. Why should we study it if it doesn't affect us? So, the final view that we're going to talk about is what's called the historical background approach, and that's basically the approach that we're taking in this class. And this perspective emphasizes the fact that you need to see the book as written to the Christians in Asia Minor, that it was written talking about things happening in his own time. Therefore, we have to understand what was going on. We have to understand where they were before we can understand it. After we understand that, then we can draw lessons from that and apply it to ourselves. Now, this is the same thing that we do when we study about the problems in Corinth. We say, you know, they had problems with this and this and this, and we understand that. And then we say, well, how does that apply to us? And we say, well, we understand the principles involved, and we apply them to ourselves. And that's how we benefit from the study of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Well, this is the same way that we benefit from the study of Revelation. We look and see what they had going on, take those principles, and then apply them to ourselves. I think I just summarized the next 2 or 3 slides. And so the primary message to those first century Christians was that the church is going to make it. It wasn't going to be wiped out. God's in control. He's going to take care of it. And they needed to know this because they were scared. Things were happening beyond their control. They needed to know that God was in control and he wasn't going to let the church die out. And so the purpose of this book was to strengthen their courage. And he did this by showing them these things that says that, God's going to keep the church safe and that the Roman Empire is going to fall. Anyone have any questions about this so far? Because that's kind of the end of this lesson besides the questions.
I think all these theories that we hear show that people are not taking seriously the curse that's pronounced at the end of the book of Revelation. That if you add to this book, you're going to have the plagues added to you. And if you take away from it, you're going to have your name taken out of the book of life. That's pretty serious.
Yes.
And yet, there's a lot of careless approaches that we're seeing here in the book.
Well, I agree with what you said. I don't know that careless is the word I would use. I think a lot of these people were sincere when they came up with these ideas and trying to understand. I just think they were wrong.
Well, that's the same way with denominational teaching, they're sincere.
Yes.
And sometimes we're careless in our acceptance
Yes.
there, of a view that may have no biblical base at all. And I think a lot of times we're guilty of that without even realizing. I mean, just set the book of Revelation aside, and we grow up accepting things because that's what we're taught as we grow up. And when we reach adulthood, we don't see the effort or the need, therefore, an effort to look beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for no matter how long any of us have been Christians, it is careless of us to just accept the status quo, so to speak. We need to continually be studying, to be looking beyond the things that we've just been taught, and make sure those things that we've been taught are the truth.
Yes.
A lot of people have the attitude that it was good enough for my parents and grandparents, it's good enough for me.
A lot of people do believe that.
That's not what the Bible says. Each man is judged on his own merits.
Yes.
A lot of people believe that.
But we can't be careless and accept every false belief that there is out there.
So, and that's why we have to be careful, even though Homer Haley may be a good person and wrote a good revelation, we're still responsible for studying ourselves. Too many people, they sell themselves short a little bit. They'll say, well, obviously I can't understand everything, so I'll just believe what the preacher says.
Well, and Brother Haley's a good example of that, because no matter how good his commentary on Revelation may or may not be, he taught some things
That we're wrong.
were absolutely contrary to the truth in other areas.
Mm-hmm. And so you're responsible for learning it yourself. And the example put forth in the Bible is the Bereans. They studied the scriptures to see whether or not it was so. And we're obligated to do the same things. So,
I don't think we as people should follow anybody other than what the Bible says. If that person is teaching the truth and he's a good example, that's good and we follow his example. But if we find out that what he's teaching is wrong, we need to acknowledge that too.
yes. Paul said, be followers of me as I am following Christ. Sandra?
I think, part of times we don't want to be quiet and have quiet and peaceful lives, and a lot of these, interpretations give lend their way to sensationalism, and sometimes it's exciting to think that any minute the cars are gonna go haywire, and people are gonna float away, and that's kind of an exciting kind of thing to think about, and wars, and rumors of wars, and people are coming in some colors because of what's fixing to happen, and I just think, sometimes people enjoy that excitement. Not that it's not as pleasant for them, but it's just,
It's something stirred up that they like to be part of. Anyone else? Well, going into the questions. First one, what are the great themes in the book? We talked about those: relationship between God, the church, and the state, the martyrdom and persecution, and then warfare and victory. Those are the three main themes that we talked about in the book. The relationship between the Roman state and Christianity. We talked about that. Initially, it was thought of as a sect of Judaism and therefore accepted, but then whenever they came to see that it was not, they didn't like it. Citations that provide evidence that Revelation is about martyrs and martyrdom, well, it's scattered throughout the book. We mentioned Antipas particularly as someone who had been martyred. It talks about things like the hour of trial. You have the vision of the martyred saints beneath the altar. And then Revelation 11 talks about the two martyrs. And so the idea of martyrdom is throughout the book. Why are the words make war, fight, battle, and victory frequently used in the book? Well, because that's what we're in. We're in a spiritual war. And those are terms used to talk about war. And then who are the combatants in the book of Revelation? Well, God versus Satan is kind of the overlying big one. Good versus evil, which they represent. And then the church versus the Roman Empire. The 5 approaches that we went through. And then we discussed the problem. So next time we'll pick up talking about the letters to the churches. And so we finally gotten through the introduction, and this next section, I think, is where we can start applying it to ourselves. Thank you.